Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's Castle Report. This is Friday, the 9th day of January in the year of our Lord 2026. I will be discussing the raid in Venezuela, the capture or arrest, as the DOJ likes to call it, of Nichalas Maduro and his wife, and their criminal prosecution by U.S. federal authorities in the Federal District Court of New York. Did it benefit anyone? Was it right? Was it wrong? Was it legal or illegal? Yes, folks, 2026 has barely started, and it's already been quite a year. Was the capture of Maduro an indication by the administration that 1 year of his term is complete and now the gloves come off? I certainly think that was one of the many intentions of the raid, but not the most significant by any means. What then was the real intent, the real reason for the raid? The truthful answer to that question is, I don't know. Neither does anyone else, most likely. We look at it and we see the results short term, but what was the mind, in his mind, only he knows for sure. Let's look first at the legality of the raid. In my opinion, it was clearly legal. If U.S. law is the judge, that is, the 1973 War Powers Resolution allows the President to deploy military forces however he chooses without prior approval of Congress. If he decides it's in the national security interest of the United States, he can do it. It's more than a little hypocritical for any Democrat with a microphone to scream illegal because they could always repeal the War Powers Act anytime they want, but they don't. Why not? Because they use it too and they want it available. When Hillary Clinton rejoiced at the death of Muammar Gaddafi, who was killed in a U.S. bombing attack while apparently asleep in his bed, was that illegal? What about when George Bush sent American forces into Iraq and eventually hanged Saddam Hussein? Was that illegal? In fact, Trump should be thanked by Maduro and his supporters in Congress because he could have sent a cruise missile through the window of Maduro's bedroom, but instead he arrested him. The DOJ insists this was a law enforcement action whereby a wanted fugitive was arrested in a foreign country. So the question is, what do you mean by illegal? Clearly, it does not violate U.S. law, so perhaps you mean it violates your sense of consciousness or morality. Well, most of what the U.S. government does violates my sense of morality, but that is not the judge. I guess the argument then is that it violates international law. My answer to that is that international law is a nebulous concept that doesn't even exist anymore. International law was invented at Nuremberg as a way to justify dealing with Nazi war criminals when there was little real evidence of the crimes which they were charged. In other words, it began and ended at Nuremberg. Okay, then, did anything good come out of the raid? Yes, lots of things, starting with the way the raid was conducted. This was perhaps the greatest, most successful Special Forces raid in history. Conducted in a foreign capital with very few known casualties, as I said. He could just put a warhead on Maduro's forehead, as they say in the military, but he didn't do that. So in that sense, the rule of law is still intact. To carry that thought forward, the president has this very elite force, this very elite military force, the best of the best. And he is committed to using them to accomplish his foreign policy rather than mobilizing vast armies with coalition partners at a cost of hundreds of billions of dollars. Everyone around the world took notice, and the countries you would expect voiced their disapproval, but at the same time, they know he's not bluffing. When he warns that he will act, it is prudent for them to pay attention. It was a demonstration of what the U.S. military can do, especially when you consider that Venezuela supposedly had the latest version of Russian and Chinese anti-air defense systems installed. It was Trump's version of "we are still here, we're still the best," so pay attention, folks. The other benefit that is hard to argue against is that Maduro is a very bad man. Venezuela will be better off without him. There was an election in 2024 which was won by Edmundo Gonzalez, but Maduro used his military to hold on to the most addictive thing in this world, and that is power. He was so bad as a leader that 20% of the Venezuelan population left the country. I personally know many Venezuelan people, some of whom live here in America, some of whom live in Venezuela. They're happy he's gone. The pro-Maduro crowds of young white liberals marching through the streets of New York are really anti-Trump people, not pro-Maduro people. I guess one can justify supporting a vicious dictator if it means hurting Trump. The crowds of Venezuelan people rejoicing in the streets of Caracas are far more important than those in New York. Sometimes I think the people in such demonstrations have lost touch with reality. Certainly, they have lost touch with the needs of ordinary people if they ever had touch with them. It reminds me of when Trump sent the National Guard into the most crime-ridden cities to help slow violent crime. Washington, D.C. was first, but my city of Memphis, Tennessee was also included. The people in New York marching against the deployment were probably the same people as the pro-Maduro crowd, but in the streets with the people, it was different. I talked to many people in my law office who live out there in the streets. They live with reality, and that reality is constant fear of violent crime. People told me in no uncertain terms they were glad to see the guard on the streets. They felt safer walking, going shopping. The people of the cities worry about whether their kids will be killed in a drive-by, so they are glad for protection. So Maduro was a very bad man who caused many people to leave their country. Many more were starving. Yes, that's right, folks. He was a leader who lived in palatial luxury while his people literally starved. Venezuela has one of the largest deposits of petroleum in the world, but the people have no gas. We learned after Maduro's capture that the infrastructure of pumping and getting oil to the market was in very poor state, so much so it could take up to 10 years to fully bring it up to speed. Venezuela has all this wealth under its soil, under its ocean, but no one cared enough for the people to exploit it for their benefit. Will the American oil companies that are competing for Venezuelan oil use it for the benefit of the people of Venezuela? Well, that's a good question, but I believe while Trump is president, they will. Right now, Venezuela is left in a highly volatile, uncertain phase of its history. Who will lead after Maduro? Delcy Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president, is in charge as I record this. She talked tough, but only for a moment. Then she saw the light and started saying things like, I will be glad to cooperate with the Americans. I'm just glad to be here, folks. That is, of course, another point, and that is that he did leave her in power. He let natural progression take its course. Opposition leader, Nobel Prize winner Maria Corina Machado said she would like to see Gonzales given power because he won the election in 2024, but Trump seems committed to let the laws of succession take their course. So the next several months are very uncertain. Many questions remain. Will Rodriguez accommodate U.S. pressure and demands? Will she defy them? Or perhaps some hardline socialist from Maduro's old party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, will try to seize power? One thing should be obvious, though, and that is that the U.S. military will be used if it becomes necessary, so the leaders of that country should take notice. So the president is reimposing the Monroe Doctrine to protect U.S. interest in this hemisphere. When President Monroe announced the doctrine in 1823 and 24, it was to be a two-way street. To the European colonialist, he said, stay out of our hemisphere, we will stay out of yours. Spain had colonies in the Caribbean, so it was primarily directed at them. And it eventually took the Spanish-American War to get Spain out of the Caribbean. It would be hard to argue that the U.S. has stayed out of European affairs since the U.S. has fought 2 world wars over there. Currently, it has bases and troops all over Europe. In addition, the U.S. has China surrounded by bases and carrier battle groups. So, two-way street, no, folks, not yet. Perhaps it indicates a return to the old Monroe Doctrine, whereby the U.S. watches its own backyard and lets others do the same. I, for one, would be happy if that were the policy. In regard to that thought, Trump has repeatedly referred to the Venezuelan oil deposits as, quote, our oil. Is he bringing a Machiavellian concept of might makes right to the table with that expression? No, I don't think so. He's referring to the contracts U.S. companies had with Venezuelan government before Hugo Chavez took power back in 1998. One of Chavez's first acts was to nationalize the oil industry, thus stealing all the oil, at least from an American contractor point of view. So Trump is referring back to the pre-Chavez days and saying by contract that oil is ours and you should thank me instead of criticizing me for enforcing contracts and the rule of law. None of that had anything to do with Nichalas Maduro, of course, since it happened long before he took power. Chavez named Maduro as his successor from his deathbed in 2010. Venezuela is supposed to have free elections. But if you know the history of that country, that region, you know that often free elections are just something in name only. You've probably noticed that I've spent very little time on the topic of drug interdiction. That's because the whole concept is ridiculous and had very little to do with U.S. military action. Slowing the flow of narcotics into the U.S. was at best a side benefit, but it made for good theater. Interestingly, Bibi Netanyahu made his fifth visit to the Trump White House down in Mar-a-Lago, I think, just before this happened. Bibi had been complaining for some time that Venezuela was allowing Iran to train its terrorists there. He said he wanted something done about it. So, was it an Israeli operation? I don't know that. Since knowing is virtually impossible, but I will wager it didn't hurt. Finally, folks, from all this talk, you might get the impression that I'm in favor of this attack, but no, so folks, I'm afraid not. America first, to me, means that we have enough problems right here at home to last all of our lifetimes. I think the American people are about sick of foreign policy. They're about foreign policy out, in other words, rather than empire building or the imperialism of Pax Americana. Our concerns or should be here at home. I reject these grandiose schemes in favor of home and family the way it should be. Let us raise our children in peace and prosperity. That's what we want. Keep the price of ground beef modest. That's what we want, not foreign adventure. At least that's the way I see it. Until next time, folks, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.